I am your host, Nero Wolfe. Let's begin our journey.
It was a Tuesday in January, the kind of New York morning where the sky looks like a sheet of dirty slate and the wind off the Hudson has enough edge to shave a man without soap. Inside the brownstone on West 35th Street, the world was as it should be. Nero Wolfe was upstairs in the plant rooms for his 9 to 11 shift with the orchids, and Fritz Brenner was in the kitchen doing something complicated with a brace of ducks. I was at my desk in the office, catching up on the bank balance and wondering if the blizzard predicted for tonight would finally give me an excuse to avoid a trip to the dentist. The piece lasted until 10:14 when the doorbell rang. It wasn't the rhythmic, polite ring of a man with an appointment. It was the frantic, staccato tapping of someone who thought the house was on fire, or worse, that they were about to be. I went to the front door, checked the chain, and opened it just enough to see a man who looked like he'd been dragged through a hedge backward. He was in his late 50s, wearing a charcoal overcoat that cost more than my first 3 cars combined, but his face was the color of skimmed milk. "I must see Mr. Wolfe," he wheezed, shivering as a gust of sleet followed him into the hallway. "It's a matter of absolute urgency. My name is Julian Vane. Mr. Wolfe is with his plants, Mr. Vane. He doesn't see people before 11, and even then he usually requires a reason that doesn't involve shivering on the rug. If you'd like to wait in the front room, I'll see if I can find a towel for your dignity." "No time," Vane said, clutching a small leather-bound ledger to his chest as if it were a shield. "Tell him I am the executor of the late Elias Thorne's personal papers. Tell him that someone is systematically poisoning the Thorne legacy, and I don't mean with a pen." I led him into the front room and went back to the office to wait for the elevator. When the clock struck 11, the groan of the machinery told me Wolfe was descending. He emerged from the elevator, crossed the room with his usual monumental gait, and settled his 1/7 of a ton into the custom chair behind his desk. He looked at the stack of mail I'd placed there as if it were a personal insult. "Archie, why is the heating bill up 12%? "Because it's January, and you insist on keeping the orchids at a tropical simmer," I said, leaning against my desk. "Also, we have a guest. A Mr. Julian Vane. He brought some sleet and a ledger. He says someone is poisoning the Thorne legacy." Wolfe's eyelids flickered. Elias Thorne had been a man of immense wealth and even immenser secrets, and Wolfe had once spent 3 weeks deciphering a code for him that involved the movement of the Ottoman treasury. "Mr. Vane is the executor?" Wolfe asked, his voice a low rumble. "So he says. He's currently in the front room looking like he expects the walls to start talking. He mentioned poisoning, but I suspect he meant it literally. He was clutching that ledger like it held the secret to eternal life." Wolfe sat in silence for a full minute, his fingers performing a rhythmic, heavy drumming on the arms of his chair. He hated disruptions to his morning, especially ones that brought the dampness of the outside world into his sanctuary. But the name Thorne carried a specific historical weight. "Bring him in, Archie, and tell Fritz we shall need more than coffee. If Julian Vane is here, the winter is about to get significantly colder." I went to the front room and found Vane staring at a portrait on the wall with the intensity of a man looking for a trap door. I ushered him into the office. As he sat in the red leather chair, he didn't look at Wolfe. He looked at the office door I had just closed, his ears practically twitching at every sound from the hallway. "Mr. Wolfe," Vane began, his voice barely a whisper, "the Thorne estate is a labyrinth. But someone has found the center. Last night, at the commemorative dinner for the Thorne Foundation, the wine was tampered with. Not enough to kill, but enough to send a message. And this morning I found this in the vault." He placed the ledger on Wolfe's desk. Tucked inside the front cover was a small dried orchid, a cattleya, smeared with what looked like black ink. Wolfe didn't touch the book. He stared at the orchid, his face becoming a mask of granite. To others, it was a threat. To Nero Wolfe, It was a desecration of the one thing he held sacred. The hook was set, and it wasn't the Thorn legacy that had done it. It was the flower. "Archie," Wolfe said, his eyes narrowing until they were mere slits of black fire. "Clear the calendar for the week. Mr. Vane, you will stay for lunch. We have much to discuss, and very little time before the frost sets in for good." By noon the blizzard had arrived in earnest, turning the world outside the brownstone into a swirling white void. But the real storm was gathering in our front hall. Julian Vane's arrival had been the pebble that started an avalanche, and by 12:30 the snow wasn't the only thing piling up at the door. Vane had barely finished his second cup of Fritz's coffee when the doorbell began a relentless, demanding chime. I went to the door and found myself looking at a trio that looked like they had stepped out of a high society funeral, cold, polished and smelling of expensive wool and quiet desperation. First through the door was Beatrice Thorne, the late Elias's niece, and a woman whose spine seemed to be made of the same tempered steel as her jewelry. She didn't wait to be invited. She simply marched into the hallway, shaking sleet from her fur coat with a localized violence that made me fear for the umbrella stand. Behind her was Silas Thorne, a cousin with a weak chin and a strong thirst, judging by the slight tremor in his hands and the faint scent of juniper that trailed him. Bringing up the rear was Arthur Penhaligon, the family's long-time legal counsel, a man who looked like he'd been carved out of a very old, very tired oak tree. "I know Julian is here, Goodwin," Beatrice snapped, her voice cutting through the warmth of the hallway like a meat cleaver. "He has no right to hold those papers. They are Thorne property, and this public display of paranoia is an insult to my uncle's memory." I ushered them into the front room, but they didn't stay there. Like a slow-moving tide of entitlement, they drifted toward the office. I didn't try to stop them. When a Thorne decides to move, it's usually better to let them hit the wall of Nero Wolfe's desk than to try and catch them mid-stride. Wolfe was still seated behind his desk, the small, ink-smeared orchid still resting on the blotter. He didn't look up as they entered. He didn't even acknowledge the draft they brought with them. He simply sat there, his fingers interlaced over his middle, watching the dust motes dance in the light of the desk lamp. The tension in the room was thick enough to be served as a side dish. Julian Vane, seeing the Thorne clan, shrank into the red leather chair, clutching the ledger as if it were a life raft. "Mr. Wolfe," Penhaligon began, stepping forward with a professional cough. "We represent the board of the Thorne Foundation. There has been a most unfortunate misunderstanding at the club, and Mr. Vane's emotional state has led him to take certain liberties with confidential documents. We are here to retrieve them and escort him home." Wolfe finally looked up. His eyes didn't go to the lawyer. They went to Beatrice, then to Silas, and finally settled on the orchid. "Liberties? Mr. Penhaligon, is that what you call a deliberate act of botanical desecration? Or perhaps you were referring to the wine? I am told it had a most distinctive and entirely uninvited aftertaste." Beatrice Thorne stiffened. A prank, nothing more. A disgruntled kitchen worker, or a jealous rival for the Foundation's grants. It is a matter for the police, perhaps, but certainly not for a private investigator with a penchant for overcharging. "The police," Wolfe murmured, the words sounding like a dry leaf skittering across a sidewalk. "They are remarkably efficient at filing reports. They are less efficient at understanding the nuance of a cattleya smeared with printer's ink. This flower was taken from my own supplier 3 days ago. I recognize the strain. Its presence here is not a prank, it is a trespass. It is a message delivered in a language I happen to speak fluently." Silas Thorne let out a nervous, high-pitched laugh. "It's just a flower, Wolfe. Good Lord, Julian has us all jumping at shadows because someone put a little ipecac in Burgundy. Let's just take the ledger and go before the drifts get any higher." "The ledger stays," Wolfe said, his voice dropping into a register that made the glass on the bookshelves vibrate. "And for the duration of this storm. So do you. Archie, the front door is to be bolted. Mr. Brenner has prepared a lunch for 6, though I suspect the conversation will be less than nourishing. Since you have seen fit to invade my home to retrieve a secret, you shall remain here while I decide which of you is responsible for the invitation." The uninvited entourage looked at each other with a mixture of fury and genuine shock. People did not tell the Thorns what to do, and they certainly didn't tell them they were staying for lunch, as if they were naughty schoolchildren. But Wolfe wasn't looking at them anymore. He was looking at the ledger, his mind already beginning to sift through the invisible threads that connected these 4 people to the ink-stained orchid. I moved to the door and slid the bolt home with a satisfying, heavy thud. "You heard the man," I said, offering a smile that I knew would only make Beatrice Thorne angrier. "The brownstone is officially snowbound. We have plenty of room, plenty of beer, and a master of ceremonies who doesn't like to be interrupted. I suggest you find a chair. It's going to be a very long afternoon." As I led them back to the parlor to wait for Fritz's announcement, I saw Wolfe reach out a single fleshy finger and touch the petal of the ruined orchid. He wasn't thinking about the Thorne legacy anymore. He was thinking about the person who had dared to use a flower as a threat. I knew right then that for the mastermind behind this, the blizzard was about to be the least of their worries. By the time Fritz announced that a light repast of poached salmon and cucumber mousse was ready in the dining room, the parlor had become a psychological pressure cooker. I stood in the doorway, acting as a one-man border patrol, and watched the Thorne dynasty pretend that they weren't all wondering which of their cousins was a poisoner. The circle was complete, and as I ushered them into the dining room, I began to catalogue the motives that were drifting around the room like invisible smoke. First there was Beatrice Thorne. She sat at the table with a rigid grace, her eyes never leaving the ledger that Wolfe had insisted on bringing into the room. As the eldest niece, she had the most to lose if Julian Vane started poking into the discretionary funds Elias Thorne had left behind. I had heard rumours that Beatrice's personal gallery in Chelsea was built on a foundation of loans that never quite made it onto the official books. If the ledger contained the truth about the estate's liquidation, Beatrice would be trading her furs for a very public bankruptcy. She looked at Julian with a cold, predatory focus that suggested she'd prefer to see him under 6 feet of snow rather than behind a desk. Then there was Silas Thorne, the cousin who seemed to be composed entirely of nervous tics and expensive gin. He was supposed to be the family's representative on the foundation's investment board, but the word on the street was that Silas had a fondness for high-stakes poker that exceeded his talent for it. He kept checking his reflection in the silver water pitcher, adjusting his silk tie as if it were a noose. If someone had been skimming the Thorne accounts to pay off a bookie in Jersey, Silas was the leading candidate. He had the access, the desperation, and a sweat-beaded brow that was doing him no favours in the suspicion department. Across from him sat Arthur Penhaligon, the lawyer who looked like he had been marinated in legal precedent. Penhaligon had been Elias Thorne's gatekeeper for 30 years. He knew where everybody was buried, mostly because he had likely drawn up the deeds for the cemeteries, but gatekeepers have a habit of watching others spend the gold they protect. I noticed the way his eyes tracked every movement Wolfe made. It wasn't the look of a worried counsellor, but the look of a man trying to see if the opposing general had spotted the hole in his flank. If there was a systematic poisoning of the legacy, the man with the keys to the vault was the most logical hand on the bottle. Finally, there was our original snowman, Julian Vane. He sat at the far end of the table, looking like he expected the salmon to bite back. Vane wasn't a Thorne by blood, only by service, and that was the sharpest motive of all. He had been the loyal executor, the man who did the heavy lifting while the family did the spending. Perhaps he had grown tired of being the help. Bringing the ledger to Wolfe could be a masterstroke of misdirection, the victim who cries for help to hide the fact that he's already looted the house and set the timer on the bomb. Wolfe sat at the head of the table, a monumental presence that seemed to shrink the room. He didn't speak during the first course. He ate with a rhythmic, focused appreciation that ignored the glares of Beatrice and the whimpers of Silas. It wasn't until the plates were cleared that he leaned back, his eyes narrowing as they traveled from one face to the next, weighing the silence. "A fascinating group," Wolfe murmured, his voice a low rumble that seemed to vibrate the crystal. "A niece with an appetite for art, a cousin with an appetite for risk, a lawyer with an appetite for order, and an executor with an appetite for safety. You all claim to be here to protect the Thorne legacy, yet you radiate the specific energy of individuals who are terrified of what that legacy actually contains. We are here because Julian has stolen family property," Beatrice snapped, her fork clattering against her plate. "This ledger is not his to share with an outsider. My uncle's private affairs are his own, even in death. Privacy is a luxury for the innocent, Miss Thorne," Wolfe countered. "When a catalier is used as a calling card for a threat, and when a foundation dinner becomes a staging ground for a chemical warning, privacy evaporates. Someone in this room knows exactly why that orchid was smeared with ink. Someone in this room knows that the ledger Julian carries is not just a record of assets, but a map of a crime." Silas Thorne let out a jagged, high-pitched laugh. "A crime? Really, Wolfe? It's just a family squabble over some old stocks. Julian is making a mountain out of a molehill because he wants a bigger cut of the commission." I watched Julian's hand tighten around his glass until I thought it might shatter. "It's not stocks, Silas," he whispered. "It's the Thorne endowment. It's gone. Or at least the half that was supposed to fund the winter shelters. The ledger shows the transfers, but it doesn't show who signed for them. I think the poisoning at the dinner wasn't a prank. I think it was a trial run. The room went cold, colder than the sleet hitting the windows. The circle was no longer just a group of bickering relatives. It was a lineup. 4 people, each with a reason to want that ledger buried under the winter ice, and each with a connection to the brownstone that went deeper than they were willing to admit. As I stood by the sideboard, watching the way the candlelight caught the sweat on Silas's upper lip and the ice in Beatrice's eyes, I knew that the next few hours would be a long trek through very dark woods. Wolfe wiped his mouth with his napkin, a gesture of finality. "Archie, you will take the afternoon to verify certain entries in Mr. Vane's book. I want to know where the Thorne money went, and I want to know who was at the printer's shop near the floral district last Thursday. It seems our mastermind has a flair for the dramatic. We shall see if they have a flair for the truth." I stood up, ready to head into the slush. The suspects were seated, the motives were served, and Nero Wolfe had just begun to sharpen his carving knife. I stepped out of the brownstone and into a world that had been replaced by a wet grey curtain of sleet. The wind on 35th Street didn't just blow, it searched for any gap in your coat with the persistence of a process server. I turned up my collar and headed for the garage. Wolfe might be able to solve the mysteries of the universe from a custom-made chair, but someone had to do the legwork, and today that someone was going to be damp. My first stop was a small, cramped office in the floral district. A man named Bloom, who had been supplying Wolfe's more common needs for years, owned the shop. It was a place that smelled of damp earth and funeral lilies, and today it felt particularly grim. Bloom was behind the counter, looking at his own ledger. I didn't waste time with the weather. I described the ink-smeared orchid and watched his face. "A cattleya, you say?" Bloom rubbed a hand over his chin. "I remember a sale last Thursday. Not a bouquet, just 3 stems. A man came in, tall. Looked like he'd been ironed by a professional. He didn't care about the freshness, he just wanted that specific shade of lavender. Paid in cash, which is rare for the Thorne types. Tall and ironed, huh? I mused. That describes half the men in the Thorne Foundation. Did he have a twitchy hand or a legal growl? Neither, Bloom said. He had a scent, not flowers. Something sharp, like the stuff they use in print shops. I figured he was a clerk picking up a peace offering for a boss. I thanked him and moved on to the next stop, the printer's shop, 2 blocks away. This was where the Thorne Foundation had its annual reports and commemorative programs made. The air inside was thick with the smell of ozone and ink, the same sharp scent Bloom had described. The manager was a harried man named Miller, who looked like he hadn't slept since the invention of the movable type. He confirmed my suspicion. A man fitting the description of a high-end clerk had been in on Friday to pick up a special order of souvenir programs for the dinner. But Miller added a kicker. The man had asked to use the back room to inspect the proofs privately for an hour. I stood in the slush outside the shop, the pieces starting to rattle around in my head. A tall, well-dressed man with the smell of a print shop on his hands, buying orchids and spending quality time with the Foundation's official documents. It wasn't Silas. He wouldn't know a print shop from a laundromat. It didn't quite fit Penhaligon either. The lawyer would have sent a subordinate. I spent the next 3 hours chasing the money. I have a friend at a certain midtown bank who owes me a favor, involving a dropped speeding ticket and a very delicate explanation to his wife. He let me look at the Thorne Foundation's recent activity. The discretionary funds Julian had mentioned weren't just being skimmed, they were being siphoned. Large sums were moving into a holding company called Labyrinth Holdings. The signatory for the accounts wasn't Beatrice or Silas, it was a dual signature requirement, Julian Vane and Arthur Penhaligon. I sat in a drugstore with a cup of lukewarm coffee and a soggy notepad. The legwork was painting a picture that didn't match the drama in the parlor. Julian Vane, our terrified snowman, was one of the 2 people who could move the money, and Penhaligon, the guardian of order, was the other. Yet Julian was the one who had brought the ledger to Wolfe, and Penhaligon was the one trying to take it back. If they were partners in theft, why fireworks? And where did Beatrice and Silas fit in, other than as convenient distractions with their own minor sins? I checked my watch. It was 4:30. I decided to make one last stop at the club where the dinner had been held. The head waiter was a man who appreciated the color of a $5 bill. He remembered the wine incident clearly. It wasn't the whole bottle, Mr. Goodwin, just the glasses at the head table. The carafe was replaced halfway through the toast. I saw a man in the pantry just before the serving, thought he was one of the event coordinators. He was wearing the Foundation's official ribbon. Did you see his face? Only his back. But he was wearing a very distinctive ring, a gold signet with a bird of some kind, a hawk maybe. I felt the click. I remembered that ring. I'd seen it an hour ago resting on the tablecloth in Wolfe's dining room as Arthur Penhaligon reached for his water. I headed back to the brownstone, the sleet now turning into a full-blown blizzard. My feet were frozen, my coat was a sponge, and I had a pocket full of contradictions. The lawyer had the ring and the signature power, but the clerk with the ink on his hands didn't match his profile. And Julian Vane was either the world's best actor or a man being framed by his own signature. As I let myself into the hall and stamped the snow off my shoes, the house was silent, too silent. I went straight to the office. Wolfe was in his chair, staring at the ledger. He didn't look at me as I entered. "The printer's ink is the key, Archie," he said, his voice a low, dangerous rumble. "But it is not on the ledger. It is on the orchid, and the orchid was a distraction. Did you find the sign?" "I found it, sir, Penhaligon. But there's a holding company, and Julian is on the paperwork too. And there's a man who smells like Miller's shop running around buying flowers." Wolfe's eyes went to the door. "Then we are just in time. While you were in the slush, the brownstone has been violated in a much more subtle fashion. Go to the kitchen, tell Fritz to check the herb cabinet. I believe we have had a visitor who doesn't use the front door. I didn't ask questions. I headed for the kitchen, my hand moving toward the holster under my coat. The legwork was done, but the real work was just beginning, and the blizzard outside was nothing compared to the chill I felt in the hallway. I found Fritz standing by the auxiliary herb rack, a small cabinet made of seasoned oak that usually housed the more volatile dried spices. He wasn't cooking, he was staring at the porcelain jars with the kind of expression a priest might have upon finding graffiti on an altar. Fritz is a man who can tell if a single grain of peppercorn has been moved out of alignment. Now his world is tilted. "Archie," he said, his voice a tight whisper of professional outrage, "the saffron and the mountain sage, they have been disturbed." I moved to his side, my eyes scanning the shelves. To the uninitiated it looked like a collection of jars. To anyone who lived in the brownstone it was a crime scene. The jar of Spanish saffron, worth more than its weight in gold and kept in a specific shaded corner, had been rotated 45 degrees. The mountain sage was worse, the lid was slightly askew, and a few grey-green flakes were dusted across the wood. "Nothing is missing, Fritz?" I asked, keeping my hand off the evidence. "No, it is not theft, it is a search. Someone was looking for something small, something hidden, and they did not care that I would know." I left him to his indignation and headed back to the office. The home's internal geography was changing. While I was out in the slush, and while Wolfe was presiding over the Thorne family's mutual loathing in the dining room, a ghost had been walking the halls. I walked into the office and found Wolfe staring at the small wall safe behind the picture of the waterfall. The picture was straight, but there was a faint, nearly invisible smudge of grey on the frame, the same ink-tinted dust I'd smelled at the printer's shop. "The vault was not opened, Archie," Wolfe said, his voice so low it was almost a growl, "but it was tested. Our visitor is a man of technical proficiency and immense arrogance. He did not come for the Thorne money, he came for the ledger. He assumed that because I was occupied with the appetites of his employers, my house was an open field. He used the service entrance," I said, leaning against the desk. "He must have a key, or a very good set of picks, and he knows the layout. He went for the herbs first, maybe looking for a hidden compartment, and then he came in here. But the Thorne clan was in the dining room with you. I checked the hall, they never left the table." Wolfe's fingers performed a slow, heavy dance on the arm of his chair. "Indeed. Which means our mastermind did not send a family member, he sent a tool. A tool who smells of Miller's shop and buys lavender orchids. But the violation of the herb cabinet tells us something the ledger does not. The intruder was looking for the original Thorne codicil, the document Elias Thorne allegedly wrote 3 days before his death, altering the distribution of the winter shelter funds. Julian didn't mention a codicil, I noted. He just talked about the missing millions. "Because Julian does not know it exists," Wolfe murmured, "but Arthur Penhaligon does. And so does the person who hired our ink-stained ghost. They believe that I have already secured it, or that Julian hid it within this house for safekeeping." The trespass had changed the atmosphere of the brownstone from a sanctuary to a trap. It's one thing to have suspects in the parlour, it's another to have an uninvited guest moving through the kitchen while you're eating your salmon. I felt a prickle of heat behind my neck that had nothing to do with the radiator. "The signet ring, Archie," Wolfe said, suddenly sharp. "You saw it on Mr. Penhaligon. But did you observe the hand? Was it steady? He's an old man. It was steady enough to hold a water glass, but he looked like he was bracing for a fall. Silas is the one with the shakes." "Go back to the dining room," Wolfe commanded. "The meal is over. Bring them in here, all of them. And Archie, tell Saul Panzer to meet you at the back door in 10 minutes. If we have a ghost in the house, I want a man of Saul's talents to find where he is hiding. A blizzard is a perfect screen for a man who doesn't wish to leave, but it is also a prison for a man who cannot." I went to the dining room. The Thorne family was sitting in a silence that was brittle enough to snap. Beatrice was tapping a cigarette on a silver case. She knew she wasn't allowed to light. Silas was staring at the bottom of an empty wineglass, and Penhaligon was looking at the snow-piled windows as if he were waiting for a rescue party that wasn't coming. Julian Vane was the only one who looked relieved to see me. "Mr. Wolfe wants you in the office," I said, my voice as flat as a sidewalk. "The social hour is over. We've had a minor disruption in the kitchen, and the boss wants to discuss the finer points of household security." Penhaligon's head snapped up. Disruption? What sort of disruption? The kind that leaves fingerprints in printer's ink, I told him, watching his face. He didn't flinch, but his eyes went momentarily vacant, a shutter clicking shut behind the legal mask. As I ushered them back into the office, the house felt smaller, the walls leaning in. The subtle trespass had achieved its goal. It had stripped away the last of the Thorne dignity. They weren't just suspects anymore, they were participants in a siege they didn't fully understand. I stepped out to the back hall to meet Saul, leaving Wolfe to face the four of them alone. The blizzard was screaming against the kitchen door, but as I saw Saul's sharp, monkey-like face peering through the glass of the service entrance, I knew the ghost's time was running out. The vault hadn't been breached, but the piece of the brownstone had, and Nero Wolfe was about to make the intruder pay a very high price for the smudge on his picture frame. I met Saul Panzer by the service entrance, where the wind was trying its best to turn the kitchen into an icebox. Saul looked like a man who had spent the last hour blending into a snowbank, which he probably had. He didn't waste time with a greeting. He just reached into the pocket of his damp wool coat and pulled out a small rectangular object wrapped in a silk handkerchief. It was a pocket flashlight, the expensive kind that professional burglars and very thorough night watchmen favor. I found it tucked into the molding of the dumbwaiter shaft, Archie, Saul said, his voice a low, steady rasp. It's still warm. Our guest didn't just walk through the kitchen, he's been using the service guts of the house to move between floors. While you were at the printers, someone was playing on the elevator in the dark. And there's this. He held up the handkerchief to show a small, jagged piece of grey fabric, caught on the clip of the light. Tweed, high quality but snagged in a hurry. Stay in the hall, Saul, I told him. Keep an eye on the back stairs. If our ghost tries to break into the basement, give him a reason to reconsider. I went back to the office, the flashlight heavy in my pocket. The room was now a study in frozen hostility. Wolfe was back in his chair, his hands resting on the edge of the desk, his eyes moving over the four thorns with a rhythmic, heavy pace that reminded me of a metronome in a tomb. Beatrice was standing by the window, her back to the room, while Silas was slumped in his chair, looking like he'd finally run out of gin and excuses. Arthur Penhaligon sat perfectly still, his signet ring glinting under the desk lamp, and Julian Vane was perched on the edge of the red leather chair, his knuckles white. The pressure of a blizzard is a remarkable thing, Wolfe said, his voice dropping into a register that made the silence feel even deeper. It strips away the illusions of movement. It forces us to confront the reality of the space we occupy. Mr. Thorne, your hand is trembling. Is it the cold or the realization that the man you hired to retrieve the codicil is currently trapped in a house he does not understand? Silas Thorne jumped as if Wolfe had poked him with a cattle prod. Hired? I don't know what you're talking about. I came here to help Julian. I'm a victim of this mess just as much as he is. Victims do not usually carry signals, Wolfe snapped. He reached into his desk and pulled out a small silver whistle, a dog whistle, silent to the human ear. Archie found this in the parlor sofa after you arrived. It is a specific frequency, one used by certain private security firms to signal a change in position. You weren't just sitting in the parlor, Silas. You were acting as a lighthouse for a thief. Silas went from pale to a sickly mottled grey. He looked at Beatrice, then at Penhaligon, but neither offered him a lifeline. The unity of the Thorne family was dissolving like sugar in hot tea. Silas is a fool, Beatrice said, not turning from the window, but he's a Thorne fool. He wouldn't have the wit to hire a professional. If there's a thief in this house, he belongs to the man who knows how to hide behind the law. She finally turned, her eyes like two pieces of flint directed at Penhaligon. Arthur has been managing our discretionary funds for decades. He's the one who knew about the codicil. He's the one who realized that Julian was finally going to grow a spine and bring the ledger to you. Penhaligon didn't flinch. I have protected this family from its own excesses for 30 years, Beatrice. If I sought the codicil, it was to prevent it from falling into the hands of those who would use it to destroy the foundation. My motives are institutional, not personal. Institutional theft is still theft, Mr. Penhaligon, Wolfe interjected, but you are both wrong. Silas provided the signal and you provided the motive, but neither of you has the stomach for the actual trespass. You are boardroom and lounge people. The man currently hiding in my dumbwaiter shaft is of a different breed. He is a man who knows the smell of a printer's shop and the mechanics of a vault. He is the clerk Archie traced through the slush. I pulled the flashlight from my pocket and set it on the desk. The beam caught the signet ring on Penhaligon's hand. "It's a signal, all right," I said, "but not for the police. Saul found this in the shaft, and he found the man's trail. He isn't just a thief, he's an employee. He's the head of the Thorn Foundation's internal security, a man named Halloway. And I have a feeling he's not just looking for a codicil. He's looking for a way to make sure Julian Vane never leaves this house to testify." The room went cold, colder than the wind hitting the glass. Julian Vane let out a small, choked sound. The increased pressure hadn't just exposed the theft, it had exposed a hit. The blizzard had provided the perfect cover for a murder disguised as a disappearance. Wolfe leaned back, his bulk settling with a grim finality. "Mr. Halloway is a professional. He will not move until he receives the final signal. He is waiting to sleep at home, but he has forgotten that I do not sleep when my sanctuary is violated. Archie, you will take the flashlight. You will go to the 3rd floor. If Mr. Halloway believes the dumbwaiter is his private highway, we shall provide him with a destination he did not anticipate." And Silas, Wolfe's eyes locked on the trembling cousin, "You will stay exactly where I can see your hands. If you so much as whistle for a cab, I shall ensure the police find more than just an ink-smeared orchid in your pocket." I grabbed the light and headed for the hall. Pressure was boiling. The ghost had a name now, and the family had a fracture. As I started up the stairs, the brownstone felt like a living thing, its heart beating in time with the blizzard. Halloway was somewhere in the dark, waiting for a signal that was never going to come from Silas. He was about to get one from me instead. I reached the 3rd floor landing and didn't bother with the light. I knew every inch of that hallway by touch, and right now, the shadows were my only allies. The dumbwaiter was a narrow wooden box that smelled of ancient dust and Fritz's morning pastries, but as I pressed my ear against the paneling, I heard the unmistakable rhythmic scrape of nylon against seasoned oak. Halloway was moving up. I waited until the sound reached the level of the 2nd floor, then I jammed a heavy brass bookend into the pulley wheel at the top of the shaft. The mechanism groaned, the rope went taut, and the scratching stopped instantly. I left him suspended in the dark and headed back down to the office to see how Wolfe was handling the audience. The seating chart had been rearranged. Wolfe had moved the Thorn family into a tight arc facing his desk, leaving a gap in the center that felt like an empty witness stand. He was no longer just a detective, he was a conductor, and the suspects were his orchestra, though they were currently playing out of tune. Beatrice Thorn was still standing, her eyes fixed on the ledger as if she could set it on fire with a look. Arthur Penhaligon had retreated into a shell of legal dignity, his chin resting on his hand, while Silas sat huddled in his coat, his eyes darting toward the hallway every time a floorboard creaked. "You are wondering why I have not called the police," Wolfe said, his voice cutting through the tension like a razor. "The answer is simple. The police are remarkably adept at handling the obvious, but they lack the patience for the intricate. If I were to summon them now, Mr. Halloway would be arrested for a common trespass, and you, Mr. Penhaligon, would weave a tapestry of legal justifications that would keep the Thorn millions in limbo for a generation. That does not satisfy me. I require a full accounting, and I require it before the first course of dinner is served." Penhaligon looked up, his expression unreadable. An accounting of what, Wolfe? A family's grief? A few missing ledger entries that could be explained by 100 different market fluctuations? No, Wolfe snapped. An accounting of the ink. The ink on the orchid, the ink on my frame, and the ink on the documents you haven't yet dared to destroy. Archie, report. The ghost is currently hanging between the 2nd and 3rd floors, I said, leaning against the doorframe. He's got a tweed jacket with a snag on the left sleeve and a pocket full of tools that don't belong to a clerk. He's waiting for a signal, but since Silas's whistle is on your desk, he's going to be waiting a long time. Wolfe nodded, a short, sharp movement. Excellent. Now let us look at the seating. Miss Thorne, you are on the left because you represent the traditional greed of the Thorne line, direct, unapologetic, and focused on the tangible. You wanted the ledger because you feared the loss of your gallery and your status. Mr. Silas is in the center because he is the pivot of the deception, the man whose gambling debts made him the perfect tool for a more disciplined mind. And you, Mr. Penhaligon, are right, the pillar of the establishment, the man who realized that Elias Thorne's true legacy wasn't money but control. This is an absurd performance, Beatrice hissed. You have no proof of anything other than Silas being a drunk and Julian being a coward. The proof is in the omission, Wolfe countered. You all speak of the ledger, but none of you has mentioned the winter shelters. The Thorne Foundation was built on the promise of providing for those the city forgot. Yet for 3 years not a single brick has been laid. The money moved into Labyrinth Holdings, a name that reflects your own mental architecture, Mr. Penhaligon. You didn't just skim the interest, you hollowed out the charity to fund a series of private investments in the floral trade. That is why the orchid was the message. You were mocking the very source of your new wealth. The room went still. The blizzard outside seemed to pause for a second, the silence in the office becoming absolute. I watched Penhaligon's face. The legal mask didn't crack, but his hand, the one wearing the signet ring, began to press harder against the arm of his chair. The floral trade? Silas whispered, his voice cracking. Arthur, you told me it was a shipping venture. You said the zoning board just delayed the shelters. He told you what you needed to hear to keep your signature on the vouchers, Wolfe said. He used your debts as a leash. But Julian Vane was the complication. Julian found the dual signature records in the vault. He realized the labyrinth was a dead end. So Mr. Penhaligon decided to stage a drama, a poisoning at a dinner to frighten Julian into silence, and a stolen orchid to draw me into a wild goose chase. He wanted me to focus on the family squabble while Halloway cleaned out the safe. Wolfe leaned forward, his eyes burning with a cold, intellectual fire. But the one thing a lawyer always forgets is that a house like this has its own memory. Every smudge of ink, every shifted spice jar is a testimony. You are this winter's architect, Arthur. You are the man who turned a legacy of mercy into a business of thorns. And now the seating chart is complete. You are the guest of honor, and I am about to serve the final course. I moved toward the desk, my eyes on Penhaligon. He didn't look like a lawyer anymore. He looked like an old man who had suddenly realized the ice under his feet was only an inch thick. The positioning was done. Wolfe had stripped them down to their barest motives, and the ghost was trapped in the shaft. The only thing left was the reveal, and as Wolfe reached for his beer, I knew the blizzard was the least of Penhaligon's problems. The office was a tomb of silence, save for the rhythmic, muffled thud of the sleet against the window panes. Wolfe had reached that stage of an interrogation where he no longer looked like a man, but rather a presiding deity of logic, carved from granite and fueled by beer. He took a slow, deliberate sip from his glass, his eyes never leaving Arthur Penhaligon. The lawyer had remained as motionless as a gargoyle, but the sweat on his upper lip was beginning to catch the light of the desk lamp, a glistening admission of the heat rising beneath his skin. "We have reached the point of the final course, Mr. Penhaligon," Wolfe began, his voice dropping into a low, dangerous rumble that seemed to fill every corner of the room. "The table is set, the guests are gathered, and the bill is overdue. You have spent 30 years as the guardian of the Thorn legacy, a role you performed with such impeccable dignity that no one thought to check the locks on the vault. You were the trusted advisor, the man who knew the intimate details of Elias Thorn's charitable heart. And that, sir, was your primary weapon. You used your knowledge of his mercy to mask your own avarice." Penhaligon's voice was like dry parchment being torn. "This is nothing but a series of groundless conjectures, Wolfe. You talk of floral trades and holding companies as if they were established facts. Where is your evidence? A smudge on a picture frame, a snag of tweed. You would be laughed out of any court in this state." "I'm not in court. I am in my office," Wolfe snapped, and the sheer volume of it made Silas Thorn jump in his chair. "And here I am the arbiter of reality. You speak of evidence. Archie, the flashlight." I stepped forward and placed the heavy black torch on the desk blotter. Beside it, I laid the piece of snagged tweed and the dog whistle I'd recovered from the parlor. "That was found in the dumbwaiter shaft, Arthur," I said, leaning over the desk so he could see the grit of the mechanical dust on the casing. "And the tweed matches the coat Halloway was wearing when he arrived at the Foundation dinner. But the real proof isn't the hardware, it's in the ink." Wolfe reached into his desk drawer and pulled out a small glass vial. Inside was a dark, viscous liquid. "This is the ink Miller uses at the printer's shop. It contains a specific chemical fixative used for high-gloss commemorative programs, the kind the Thorn Foundation produces by the thousands. It also leaves a microscopic residue that can be detected for days. Your man, Halloway, was not just seeking codicil, he was marking the trail. Every surface he touched in this house, the herb cabinet, the safe, the dumbwaiter rope, carries the chemical signature of that ink. And it is the same signature found on the orchid that Julian Vane found in his vault." Beatrice Thorn stood up, her face a mask of horrified realization. "Arthur, you were the one who suggested the printer. You insisted we use Miller's shop because of their discretion. You weren't protecting the Foundation, you were creating a private laboratory for your forgery." "Forgery is a harsh word, Beatrice," Penhaligon whispered, though the mask was finally slipping. "I was ensuring the survival of the institution." Elias was senile at the end. He wanted to give half the endowment to people who would only squander it. I merely redirected it to a sector that promised growth. "The growth of your own shadow empire," Wolfe countered. "You used the winter shelters as a ghost project. You moved the funds into Labyrinth Holdings, then used that capital to buy out the floral wholesalers in the city, effectively creating a monopoly under a series of dummy names. The poisoning at the dinner was a tactical maneuver to frighten Julian into resigning his executorship. Had he resigned in a panic, you would have had sole control over the records. But Julian did the one thing you didn't anticipate. He sought sanctuary with a man who values a flower as much as a truth." Wolfe leaned forward, his bulk casting a shadow that seemed to swallow Penhaligon whole. "You sent Halloway here to retrieve the original codicil because you knew that if I examined it, the ink would prove it was written not 3 years ago by a dying man, but last week by a desperate lawyer. You trespassed in my home to cover a lie, and in doing so, you provided the very proof I required. The smudge on my picture frame is not just a smudge, Mr. Penhaligon. It is your signature on a confession." The lawyer slumped back, the signet ring on his finger looking like a heavy golden shackle. Silas was whimpering now, a thin, pathetic sound of a man who realized his leash had been cut. Julian Vane sat in shock, looking at the man he had trusted for 2 decades as if he were a stranger. "The ghost in the shaft is quite ready to talk, Arthur," I added, checking my watch. "Saul is with him now. Halloway is a professional. and professionals don't like hanging in the dark for a man whose bank account is about to be frozen by the district attorney. He's already admitted to the printer's errand and the service door key you provided. Wolfe sat back, the fire in his eyes settling into a cold, satisfied glow. The interrogation is over. The final course has been served, and I find the taste quite bitter, don't you? You sought to use a blizzard to bury a crime, but you forgot that snow eventually melts. Archie, the telephone, get me Inspector Cramer. Tell him we have a package for him, and tell him to bring a large car. We have a board of directors that needs to be relocated to a more secure facility. I moved to the desk and picked up the receiver, my eyes on the four of them. The Thorne legacy was a wreck, the lawyer was a ruin, and the brownstone was about to be quiet again. As I dialed the familiar number for Homicide South, I saw Wolfe reach for his beer. The reveal was complete. The strategy had worked, and outside the blizzard was finally starting to let up, as if it knew the show was over. The office was no longer a room, it had become a vacuum, drawing the air out of the lungs of everyone present. Inspector Cramer had not yet arrived, but his presence was already felt in the heavy, expectant silence. Arthur Penhaligon sat with his head bowed, the arrogance that had sustained him for 30 years having leaked out of him like air from a punctured tire. Beside him, Silas Thorne was a portrait of damp misery, and Beatrice Thorne had finally sat down, her fur coat draped around her like the plumage of a defeated bird of prey. Julian Vane was the only one who looked alive, though it was the frantic, wide-eyed life of a man who had just seen the ground open up beneath his feet. Wolfe did not look at them triumphant. He looked at them with the profound, settled weariness of a man who had spent his afternoon sorting through garbage. He adjusted his weight in the chair, a movement that produced a groan from the wood that sounded like a final judgment. "The sour note of ambition, Mr. Penhaligon," Wolfe said, his voice a low, vibrating hum that seemed to rattle the pens on my desk. "It is a peculiar thing. You did not start as a thief. You were a man of discipline, a man of the law. But you spent too much time in the company of the Thorne millions, and you began to believe that the wealth belonged to the hands that managed it, rather than the hearts that intended it. You saw Elias Thorne's desire to help the poor as a senile eccentricity, and you decided to correct his legacy. You didn't just steal the money, you stole the mercy." Penhaligon looked up, his face a mask of grey shadows. "You don't understand the burden, Wolfe. The family was falling apart. Silas was gambling away the inheritance before the ink was dry on the death certificate. Beatrice was bleeding the accounts for a gallery that sold nothing but vanity. I was the only one keeping the Thorne name from becoming a punchline on Wall Street. I used that money to build a real empire. The floral monopoly would have secured the foundation for a century. At the cost of the very people the foundation was built to protect," Wolfe snapped, his eyes flashing with a sudden, sharp heat. "You justify your crime by claiming to be the savior of a name that you have personally dragged through the muck of forgery and attempted murder. You sent Halloway here not to protect the Thorne name, but to protect the Penhaligon neck. You were willing to let Julian Vane be silenced in my house, a guest in my sanctuary, to ensure that your labyrinth remained hidden. That is not ambition, sir. That is the desperate, clutching rot of a man who has lost his soul to a ledger." I watched the clock on the wall. The second hand was ticking toward the moment the doorbell would ring, and the real world would come crashing in. I looked at the flashlight on the desk, a silent witness to the ghost in the shaft. "The codicil, Arthur," I said, pitching my voice to cut through his self-pity. "The one Halloway was looking for, wasn't it just money? It was about Elias's final opinion of you. Julian told me his father had a private diary. He mentioned that Elias was starting to suspect you toward the end. That's why you needed that paper. It wasn't just a forgery to move money, it was a forgery to delete his suspicion." Penhaligon didn't answer. He didn't have to. The way his eyes darted toward the wall safe, the one Halloway had tested, told us everything. He had been chasing a ghost of suspicion for 3 years. convinced that somewhere in the Thorn papers was a direct accusation that would strip him of his power. He had built a fortress of lies to hide a crime, only to find that the fortress itself was the evidence. "Ambition is a hunger that is never sated," Wolfe continued, his voice regaining its calm, rhythmic pace. "It begins with a small deviation, a rotated spice jar, a minor signature, and ends with a blizzard of deception. You thought the snow would hide your tracks, but snow is the most honest of witnesses. It preserves the shape of the foot that treads upon it. Your foot, Mr. Penhaligon, is etched into the floorboards of this house in a pattern of chemical fixative and printer's ink that no legal maneuver can erase." The doorbell rang. It was the heavy, authoritative ring of a man who didn't care about floral monopolies or Thorn legacies. I went to the hall, slid the bolt back, and admitted Inspector Cramer. He was wrapped in a blue overcoat that looked like it had been through a car wash, and his face was the color of a ripe tomato. He didn't say hello. He just stomped into the hallway and looked at the office door. "Wolfe?" Cramer barked as he entered the office, ignoring the Thorns entirely. "I hope this is worth the 3 miles of slush I just drove through. My car is currently sideways on 34th Street, and I've got a sergeant with frostbite. It is worth the inconvenience, Inspector," Wolfe said, not moving a muscle. "Archie has a package for you in the dumbwaiter shaft, a Mr. Halloway who possesses a very interesting collection of burglary tools and a tweed jacket with a distinctive snag. And here," he gestured with a fleshy hand toward the seated group, "you will find the board of directors of the Thorn Foundation. I suggest you begin with Mr. Penhaligon. He has a great deal to say about the labyrinth of his own making." Cramer looked at the lawyer, then the ledger, then Wolfe. He took a cigar out of his pocket, looked at it, and put it back. He knew the look on Wolfe's face. It was the look of a man who had already won the war and was merely waiting for the cleaners to arrive. "Labyrinth, huh?" Cramer grumbled. "Sounds like I'm going to need more than one pair of handcuffs. Goodwin, show my boys to the back. And Wolfe, if I find out you've been holding out on the floral monopoly details, I'm going to have you subpoenaed before the snow melts." "The details are in the ledger, Inspector," Wolfe said, reaching for his beer. "I have no desire to keep them. They are as unpalatable as the company I have kept this afternoon. Archie, show the gentleman out. The air in this room requires a thorough cleansing." As I led the police and the ruins of the Thorn family toward the hall, I saw Julian Vane stand up. He looked at Wolfe, opened his mouth as if to say thank you, and then thought better of it. He just nodded and followed Cramer. The office was finally empty of the uninvited. The blizzard was still screaming, but the house was ours again. I closed the front door, turned the lock, and felt the first real warmth of the day. The heavy thud of the front door echoed through the hallway, signaling the final departure of Inspector Cramer's entourage and the end of the Thorn family's tenure in our parlor. I stood in the hall for a moment, listening to the house settle back into its habitual rhythm. The silence that follows a police raid is different from the silence of a library. It's a silence that feels scrubbed clean. I walked back into the office and found Wolfe exactly where I'd left him, though he had traded the ledger for a book on the history of the Ottoman Empire. His beer glass was empty, and his expression was one of settled, monumental calm. "The package has been delivered, sir," I reported, leaning against the doorframe. Cramer was grumbling about the weather, but he had a look in his eye that suggested he's already thinking about the headlines. "Cramer Cracks the Labyrinth" has a nice ring to it. I didn't mention that you did the cracking while he was busy putting on his galoshes. Wolfe didn't look up from his page. "Mr. Cramer is welcome to the headlines, Archie. They are a noisy temporary commodity. I prefer the permanence of a solved equation. Did Mr. Vane leave a contact address? He's staying at a hotel near the park until the Foundation's lawyers can untangle the mess. He looked about 10 years younger once Penhaligon was in handcuffs. I think he's going to spend the next week sleeping and the week after that trying to find a new career that doesn't involve old ledgers or poisoned wine." Fritz appeared in the doorway, his chef's whites as crisp as if the day hadn't been a marathon of household invasions and spice rack desecrations. He looked at Wolfe, and a silent communication passed between them, the kind that only exists between two men who prioritize the palate above all else. "The dinner is ready, and it is not a moment too soon," Fritz announced. "The duck has been waiting, but it is at its peak. I have prepared a cherry and port reduction to offset the January chill." "Excellent, Fritz," Wolfe said, closing his book with a snap that sounded like a final gavel. He rose from his chair, a slow and majestic process of shifting mass, and adjusted his waistcoat. "We shall require the 1906 Armagnac afterward. A palate cleansed by justice still requires a proper finish." As we moved toward the dining room, I noticed the office was already returning to its natural state. Fritz's diligent cloth had wiped the smudge on the picture frame away, and the herb cabinet in the kitchen was once again a temple of orderly jars. The subtle trespass had been erased, and the brownstone had successfully digested the Thorn legacy and found it lacking. We sat at the table, the candlelight reflecting off the silver and the dark wood. For the first 10 minutes, there was no talk of forgeries, floral monopolies, or men hiding in dumbwaiter shafts. Wolfe ate with a focused, rhythmic appreciation that was almost a form of prayer. It wasn't until the duck was a memory and the cherry sauce had been polished off that he leaned back, his glass of red wine held up to the light. "It is a curious reflection on the human condition, Archie," Wolfe murmured, his voice a low, settled rumble. "How easily a man of intellect like Mr. Penhaligon can convince himself that he is the architect of a virtue while he is actively constructing a vice. He viewed the Thorn millions as a burden he alone was fit to carry, and in doing so he became the very thing he claimed to despise. A parasite. He was a parasite with a very good tailor, I noted, and a very bad sense of direction. He thought he could use your house as a shortcut to his own safety. That's a mistake most people only make once." "He mistook my sanctuary for a tool," Wolfe said, taking a slow sip of his wine. "He believed that because I value the orchid, its desecration could manipulate me. He did not realize that a man who understands the anatomy of a flower also understands the anatomy of a lie. The ink on the petal was a signature of his own arrogance. He wanted to play a game of shadows in a house that is built on the light of logic." I leaned back, feeling the warmth of the room and the satisfaction of a closed file. The winter shelters will finally get their money too. Vane promised to see to it. I guess Elias Thorne's mercy finally caught up with Arthur's ambition. Ambition is a hunger that destroys the palate, Archie. A man who spends his life devouring the futures of others eventually loses the ability to taste the present. Mr. Penhaligon will spend the rest of his years in a confined space, reflecting on the fact that he traded the Thorn legacy for a smudge of printer's ink. Wolfe set his glass down and looked toward the window, where the blizzard was still a white blur against the dark glass. "The storm is still with us, but the draft in the hallway has been addressed. I find I'm quite satisfied with the outcome. I'm satisfied with the duck," I said, reaching for the wine decanter. "And I'm satisfied that I don't have to go back out in that slush until tomorrow morning. But you know, boss, you never did tell me. Did you know it was Penhaligon the moment you saw the orchid, or did you just wait for him to prove it?" Wolfe offered a grunt that was as close to a chuckle as he ever gets. "I knew it was someone who underestimated the intelligence of his audience, Archie. The specific choice of a Cattleya was too precise for Silas and too sentimental for Beatrice. It was the choice of a man who thinks he knows me but has never met me. He saw a detective. He should have seen a gardener." I grinned and raised my glass to him. "Well, you certainly weeded the Thorn garden today. Just don't expect me to help with the replanting." Wolfe didn't answer. He was already looking toward the door, where Fritz was approaching with the Armagnac and a plate of Stilton. The case was over. The legacy was settled, and for a few hours at least, the only thing that mattered in the brownstone was the temperature of the cheese and the depth of the brandy. I looked at the snow hitting the glass and decided that, all things considered, a winter table was a pretty good place to be.